Welcome, everyone. My name is Crispin Delgado. I'm Public Policy Director at Northern California Grantmakers. We are a philanthropy serving organization, and as the public policy lead, I strive to connect government, philanthropy, and the nonprofit sector to lift up and address the needs of communities we all serve. I am a Latino with a bald head, I'm wearing glasses, and a black shirt. Today, I'm here representing the California Policy Forum, a collaboration of Philanthropy California, Cal Nonprofits, and the League of California Community Foundations, which seeks to help educate and support organizations in leveraging their experiences working across sectors to strengthen democracy at all levels. We work to elevate communities of color and the nonprofit sector, make meaningful connections between local and national elections, and harness the deep relationship with California's grassroots power builders. I often refer to democracy being like a three-legged stool, with democracy as the seat, which is then supported by three legs: census, redistricting, and voting. They're all tied together in a timed, cascading sequence. Of course, it is often much more complicated than this stool, especially in recent times, where some would also add a leg for the narrative work that is needed to combat misinformation and disinformation. Others would add a equity leg to recognize that communities of color have historically been excluded or restricted in participating in our democratic processes, including voting. The redistricting process is about the distribution of political power. How these lines are drawn either unite or break apart communities of interest. And as many of us saw during the 2020 election, looking at the results in very specific districts within swing states, it can come down to how those lines are drawn and who is voting within those boundaries. We must ensure everyone can access free and fair elections. Those votes are securely counted and certified, and ultimately the voice of the people should prevail. Engagement in the midterm elections will determine the makeup of our congressional leadership, while also setting the stage for the 2024 presidential election. We must ensure that all Californians, regardless of color, background, or party affiliation, should have access to free and fair voting. And as we will find out from our panel today, there are definitely considerations for all of us as we look to support our communities. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We have Tuvai Samwilu, is Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as EPIC, is a pro-Black, pro-Indigenous, and anti-racist national organization based in Los Angeles that was established in 2009 to advance social justice and cultural-centered advocacy, leadership development, and research. EPIC is a fiscally sponsored project of community partners. Next, we have Jonathan Mehta-Stein, and he is a civil rights attorney and longtime democracy reform advocate. Jonathan became the executive director of California Common Cause in 2020, following 10 years on the organization's board of directors. Prior to becoming ED at California Common Cause, Jonathan served as the head of the Voting Rights and Census Program at the civil rights organization Asian Law Caucus, and as a voting rights staff attorney for the ACLU of California. He was also the chair of the Oakland Public Ethics Commission. Lastly, to round out the panel, we have Raul Macias, who joined the Haas Junior Fund in early 2021 as the Democracy Program Director. Over the last decade, he has helped lead democracy reform efforts for the Brennan Center for Justice and the Voting Rights Project of the ACLU of California. In these positions, he played a leadership role in advancing legislation, litigation, and advocacy on issues from ensuring broader, easier access to voter registration to the successful implementation of the Voters' Choice Act reforms enacted in the state in 2016. So we'll get started with the panel. Many of the civic processes that support our democracy, including census, redistricting, and voting, were administered during the pandemic, adding layers of complexity to reach voters and community members. With the redistricting process concluding recently, what went well and what could have gone better? Jonathan, let's start with you.
Thanks, Crispin, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you here today to talk about these incredibly important topics. There was a lot that went well and a lot that could have gone better. With local redistricting, as an example, we had, for the first time ever, the Fair Maps Act was in place in California, which was supposed to make local redistricting for California cities and counties more participatory, more accessible, more fair, more transparent, and more community driven. In a number of cities and counties, it actually did do that. And we saw tremendous wins where communities that have never been able to access representation won districts that keep them whole and allow them to shift power in their local communities. On the other hand, we saw plenty of local jurisdictions that manipulated the Fair Maps Act or subverted the Fair Maps Act in order to keep those in power. And it was a real lesson about how hard you have to work in order to hold power accountable at the local level and build local democracies that are responsive to community input and community participation. I think that we're going to be looking at reforms to the Fair Maps Act in the next couple of years to try to make the 2030 redistricting even better than this one. And it's a reminder to me, the way in which democracy is a year in, year out, continuous, multi-year process. The rules of the game on the 2020 redistricting were set in 2019 and prior. The rules of the game for the 2030 redistricting are going to be set in 2020, if I have anything to do about it, 2023 and 2024, because we need to take action immediately to improve the process. So this isn't a project we can engage in every 2 years when there's an election or every 10 years when there's a census or a redistricting cycle. It's an ongoing, everyday, continuous investment.
Great. Tavai, do you want to weigh in on the question?
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you, Jonathan, for providing such a great overview for all of us to follow and engage with. I want to acknowledge that the pandemic had a devastating and disproportionate impact on the Pacific Islander community across the country and especially here in California. When race and ethnicity data was first released on COVID rates in April 2020, it showed that NHPIs had the highest rates of COVID in the entire state of any racial or ethnic group. And over 2 years later, that position still remains. Our communities still continue to have the highest rates of COVID as well as the highest death rates. Given this, right, we spent years planning for what we were going to do for the census, and the second everything shut down, all of our plans went out the window. And we were having to, in our communities, as we say, build the canoe as we paddle. And then in addition to the census work we were having to do, we also needed to stand up care for our communities. In the absence of infrastructure and long-standing underinvestment or disinvestment from our communities, we had to answer the call. We had to be the ones providing groceries to those who tested positive, teaching our communities about the rates of COVID, and also translating all of the materials as our communities were deemed too small to have language access. So we took that up and we went straight from doing simultaneously, along with our really dedicated partners, census outreach and advocacy, food distribution, translating unemployment while also helping them fill out census forms. And even when that wrapped up, right, that what was supposed to be a 6-month campaign turned into 10 months, that as soon as it ended in October 2020, we had to turn right around and do civic engagement for the November elections. From November elections, we were also trying to still engage folks as a pandemic was still happening, doing vaccine outreach and education in at least Samoan, Tongan, and Marshallese. And that as we fought to advocate for our communities to be prioritized, they returned directly to us as the only ones who were equipped to serve our communities. So what we heard from our partners as we approached them around redistricting is, we are tired. We do not have the capacity to keep going because things that were supposed to be done, that we were supposed to be out of the pandemic after 3 or 6 months, over 2 years later, it still didn't disappear. And so asking them to do that multitasking without having the sufficient resources to sustain that work was too much. The other thing that we heard from our communities, because Pacific Islanders are geographically dispersed and redistricting is inherently place-based, is that they did not see the relevance for them. What did a statewide redistricting campaign mean for a community that's spread throughout cities and counties? What we heard from them is that they wanted to hear about school redistricting. They wanted to hear about counties and cities, that a highly localized approach, especially as those were the places that were dictating where they could receive resources, is what they needed most from us, that going statewide wasn't as applicable. And the last piece I'll say is we learned as well what it meant to necessitate an intergenerational approach, because we only do this every 10 years. And so reaching out and knowing, like, 10 years ago, I was still in college, and going to elders who would tell us, like, 10 years ago, this is exactly what we did. 10 years ago, this is how we engaged people. This is how we talked about redistricting, and this is what it looked like for us. So it was really helpful to lean on our elders and folks who had been around for the last process to dictate how we would actually approach and shape our infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Talai. And I'm sure what you just said really resonates with a lot of our nonprofit partners. And Raul, I want to pass the question on to you, especially from a funder perspective or a grant maker perspective.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for that important context, Divine. And throwing on top of that, in the middle of it came a recall election that also was a huge distraction and took a lot of resources and attention away. I started with the Haas Junior Fund in March of last year, and so I was, came somewhat late, a little bit late to things, and I certainly, one of the things I took away from it was just the need to start as early as possible. Groups need an opportunity to build their coalitions and add capacity, and that takes time. You can't get the grant out there and expect groups to add that capacity overnight. When I first started in March, redistricting was the first thing I focused on. I was, like I said, worried that maybe I was already too late, but I actually found where a lot of groups, they hadn't finalized plans because they hadn't found funders to fund the plans that they developed, or were waiting on funding decisions, and that there was just an urgent need for more resources. Some of the things I found helpful, that there was an integrated voter engagement redistricting alliance that we were able to plug into and meet partners that way. And we were able to fund some of the coordinating work that alliance was doing. I was grateful for that coordination at the state level, and the technical support they were offering different organizations. Philanthropy California had created a pooled fund that had done a really helpful job in terms of identifying some priority areas and helping organizations develop their proposals, and we were able to align some of our grant giving with that fund. So that was really helpful to me, especially starting so late. So, and think about what I would do in the future. I mean, I think we would want to do grant making as early as possible, and probably even before the redistricting cycle, think about grants to organizations that want to do some planning for the redistricting work and starting to build coalitions and have those conversations. So doing grants even before the actual redistricting work starts to work on the planning of it. And again, echoing what I think Tavai made a really important point about, that this only happens every 10 years. So there's so much learning and training to do early on to learn back from what happened 10 years ago and develop expertise. And to the point Jonathan made, we're supporting Common Cause and a couple of and some of their partners on work to do research and document, what did happen at the state level and in the local level when it came to redistricting. What are some places where we can do better and improvements we can make, including policy changes, and hopefully we can fund some of that work that comes out of these reports to get that done, to make the process work better for our communities next time around.
Great, thank you. And speaking of doing better, Jonathan, there was a follow-up question about, you stated that if you have anything to do with it, the rules for 2030 redistricting will be set in 2023 or 2024. How can we make this happen? And what does this rule setting process look like?
Yeah, so sorry for not providing more detail initially. As a little bit of background, in 2019, Common Cause and a variety of civil rights and civic engagement partners that focus on redistricting and structural democracy reform came together to write and pass the Fair Maps Act, which was at the time carried in the legislature by now Attorney General Rob Bonta. And the idea was, it was the first meaningful reform of local redistricting law since the 1940s. Local redistricting was the Wild West for decades. City councils and county supervisors could do anything they wanted in the cover of night. And so what the Fair Maps Act did was it said, you have to have a minimum number of hearings. You have to ensure a minimum amount of public transparency. You have to do a minimum amount of public outreach. And you have to follow line drawing criteria that are supposed to put communities of interest at the top of the list and to honor the Voting Rights Act. The reality is that the law was a really good first start, but city councils and county boards of supervisors found ways to protect their own interests and to protect incumbents and to subvert the needs of community in the process. And so now, Raul touched on this, we are working with a number of partners to interview somewhere between 20 to 40 stakeholders from across California to understand their experience, to document that in a report, and to come up with policy reforms we can take to the legislature in 2023 or 2024 to essentially ensure that the next redistricting cycle is centered on community and not centered on incumbents. And that sort of research and policy work may take us years to complete. But I said it's the reason why democracy is a decade-long experience is that the experience we have in 2023 will be built by the policy research and policy advocacy and the community and stakeholder engagement that we're able to do, in 2022, 2023, 2024.
Great, thank you for that. And please that was a great question. Please keep them coming. Tavai, this next question, I want to start off with you. Data from Census 2020 showed that California grew less than other states, resulting in California losing a congressional seat. What implications did this have for California's redistricting process, and what should voters expect?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. So part of it, in hearing that question and hearing that statistic, I think there are a lot of folks who have been flagging for a while that that was likely to happen, right? That California alone was considered the entire state a hot zone for COVID. So we knew it was going to make that complicated around the count. The other aspect is that we've heard from housing and economic justice advocates time and time again what the rising rates of the cost of living would mean for the state population. Even as the Pacific Islander population, and we've heard from our Native American siblings, how many folks cannot afford to stay here anymore, as we're finding more and more folks pushed out of what are our traditional population hubs. So what we're hearing from folks and why this is critical for the NHPI population is because California has the largest NHPI population on the continent. So what happens here is often a flagship and tends to signal for everyone else what is needed for PI communities on the continent. And so how many states, even I'll give as an example, when we got the COVID rates in California, we quickly checked in Utah, Washington, Arizona, and Hawaii, where we know our other folks are, as they stated that things were matching. So even before data came out, we were already seeing these things. That oftentimes by the time the numbers are available, our communities on their ground have already been observing all of these shifts and changes. So what we're seeing on the voting, what this means for midterms and everything else, is how much more we actually are going to have to concentrate our efforts. How do we treat all of these things that come up as places and opportunities to flex our muscle and practice, get very innovative about how we strategize things? I love that you lifted up narrative, because something, the traditional narrative around democracy doesn't actually work in a Pacific Islander community where democracy was part of a colonial inheritance, right? You think of the overthrow of the Native Hawaiian Kingdom that was a monarchy before the US empire, right? You think of Tongans, who democracy is part of the assimilation here to the US. So we talk about it very differently. And I love the work of our advocacy coordinator, Jamina, who for the June primaries came up with Voice the Voyage, leveraging our ancestry as voyagers and communicating to our communities that participation in democracy is part of our voyage, that it's about uplifting your voice and continuing the traditions and cultures that we've been able to preserve here away from home and in diaspora. Thank you.
Great response, Tavai. And I was reminded that we have to slow down because we do have this captioner working so hard for us, and we just want to make sure that everyone can access all the wonderful words you're saying. Jonathan, do you want to jump in to the same question?
Can you repeat the question for me, Christine?
Sure.
Oh, about the census?
Yeah, like what implications did losing a seat have for the redistricting process, and what should voters expect?
Well, it meant that the redistricting process the state redistricting process had to redraw our congressional districts really root and branch, because you had to take a 52 district map and turn it into a 51 district map, which meant that you couldn't tinker around the edges. Our independent citizens redistricting commission at the state level really started with a blank slate, which created more work for itself, but actually meant that its work was driven by community participation and public testimony. And in the end, they had 200 meetings. They had, I believe, 42,000 individual pieces of public comment submitted verbally or in writing. And the process was so thorough, so public, and so participatory that I think we're basically the only state in the nation that didn't have any litigation against our redistricted maps after they were drawn. But that doesn't mean that we got everything right. There are communities that were left out, that there were corners of the maps where they got things wrong. I mean, they did the best they could, but it's incredibly difficult to get everything right. And we will never, we still have to grapple. I mean, we'll talk about elections in a moment, Christine, but we have to grapple with the fact that even in California, where people think we're making tons of progress on the democracy, there are, as Tavai has mentioned, there are communities that have a particular set of experiences and challenges that make it harder for them to access our democracy. And our work is not done until we've addressed every community.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Raul, do you want to jump in?
Sure. The first thing that I thought of in terms of California losing a congressional seat, California's population actually grew. It grew by close to 6% between 2010 and 2020. And we still lost a congressional seat. And this is frustrating, especially that Congress hasn't raised the number of congressional seats in almost 100 years. It's been capped. And that has a lot of consequences. We have congressional members now who represent something like close to 3 times the number of constituents that they did. And I think it was 1930 the last time when the cap was implemented. There was, so it makes it harder in a diverse state like California, and also it has the effect of diluting our vote in the electoral college. So anyway, it's a source of frustration to our democracy that the number of congressional seats have been capped for so long. But in terms of how this plays out, I mean, there's ultimately the number of seats are, no matter what the number is, it's a limited resource. And as you said at the start of this, redistricting is about power, and it can empower communities, or it can disenfranchise communities. And with the limited number of seats, where we draw the lines just have tremendous consequences for who's going to hold political power. Well, in terms of the grants we wanted to make, we were interested in funding multiracial coalitions that were focused on trying to build power together, and so as much as possible trying to avoid pitting communities against each other in these processes. We wanted to make sure communities of color were heard during these processes, that they had the resources they need to try to track things and advocate for their interests and hold whatever bodies were making these decisions accountable.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, I'm fully aware you're on duty at the same time that you're participating on this webinar, but if you do have time, California is one of the states with the least restricting voting policies in the country, but voter turnout remains a challenge. Why is that? And what did the primaries tell us about the upcoming elections? And lastly, as if that were not enough, how can we best prepare voters for midterm elections?
Yeah, I might leave the last part of that question to Tavai, who's working face to face with voters on a regular basis. But I want to respond to the first part of it, which is that, California over the last decade, we have passed automatic voter registration, online voter registration, same-day voter registration, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. We've passed the Voters' Choice Act, allowing for early voting and location flexibility while voting. We've passed universal vote by mail and postage-paid vote by mail. We've done all of these things to make voting and voter registration easier. And the impact of that has been that we have dramatically increased voter registration rates in California, but we've done close to nothing to substantially or meaningfully increase our voter turnout rates. And we've done essentially nothing to close our voter participation disparities. We have massive entrenched voter participation gaps on the basis of race and on the basis of age, with Latino and AAPI voters in particular way behind, and young voters way behind. And I think the lesson that, at least that I take from that, is that good voting laws are necessary but not sufficient. They're important, they're essential, but they do not by themselves build us a representative and participatory democracy. And all the work that lawyers and policy advocates like myself do to get the rules of voting and voter registration right, or get the rules of redistricting as right, that's all important. But I think just as important, and maybe more important, is the work that Tavai and other base building community organizations are doing to build a culture of participation, and to make sure that people understand that now that we've lowered barriers to voting or made it easier to participate in your redistricting process, it's essential for our communities that you do so. And language access is part of this as well, and hopefully we'll get to language access in elections later today.
Great, thank you. Tavai, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not surprising to me that it's a lower turnout rate. What we learned and what we heard, and as we surveyed our communities, 75% of NHPIs are not contacted by any party to vote, right? I think some of us who are probably high propensity voters are getting like text messages every day, or get all of the mailers. And even in my own household, I saw a distinct difference between all of the mailers I received versus every other voter in my house. So the vast majority of our communities, nobody's even asking them or reaching out to them when the time comes. The other aspect, and I really appreciate that this is lifted up, the importance of integrated voter engagement, that we don't just talk to them about voting. Voting is a strategy. What we talk to them about is what they care about. We ask them, what is it? So they talked to us about education, and we said, hey, voting is a strategy to really affect change there. They asked us about health. So they come to us about voting only after, right, we have voter registration at our vaccine clinics, so that they know we don't care about them just because of their voting. We care about them wholly as humans. They can also come to us, I've seen folks that are translating things about ballots, about other educational materials. And I really appreciate, I know Jonathan does a lot of work around language access. This other component, when we talk about language justice. We say, language access might tell you that you don't meet the threshold. We know that our language is actually a way to signal cultural relevance. That if we put out voting materials in Samoan, in Tongan, in Native Hawaiian, it tells people that voting is part of our cultural responsibility. I really love the work of Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement that promotes that voting is our kuleana. It is our duty. It is actually the thing that we have to do to take care of each other. And so I think that became part of it. And the other aspect that I'll say that I'm really proud of the work that our young people are doing is that our voter turnout is 70%. 70% of the people that we contact turn out to vote. So we know that our people are going to listen to us, that they trust us when we ask them and tell them to take action on something. I think the sweetest things is seeing as we're calling people, calling elders, and just pronouncing their name correctly, how they can tell that it's a Pacific Islander calling them. And they tell our young people, I'm so proud of you for doing this. And that becomes the motivation for our young people to come back for other phone banking. That when they phone banked in 2020, they also phone banked for the September recall in 2021. And they also came back and phone banked for the June primaries this past couple of weeks. So I think this has been the most effective strategy that we've seen for mobilizing folks and continuing to talk to them. So that we've also prioritized an effort around depth as opposed to breadth, so that as people are calling, it's not going to be a 5-minute call. It may be 15 or 20 minutes where people are asking you what village you're from. And in the last 2 minutes, you tell them where they can find their polling place or drop off box.
I love everything that both you and Jonathan just laid out. And I'm wondering, Raul, if you want to reflect on what you just heard, and while I look up our next question from the audience.
Well, for the Haasman, one of our priority areas for our democracy program is to fund integrated voter engagement work, and Tavai explained that work better than I ever could. And it's just reflecting on what I heard. I mean, it's that effort to reach members of your community in a way it's not this transactional approach where where you're funding GOTV work and people are reaching out just 30 days before an election, and that's the only time you talk to people. Is about working with your communities, educating your communities, hearing from them, building power together, building your basis of the organization. That kind of work is what the Haas is prioritizing funding year-round. We're funding civic engagement tables, we're funding members of the Million Voters Project at the state level and other alliances. And it's part of a strategy for closing participation gaps, but I think it's also so much more important for all the reasons that I laid out. Just some of the other work we're doing in terms of thinking about these participation gaps that Jonathan was raising. The Haas Fund is working to bring together groups to look at language accessibility in our elections and how we are or aren't meeting the needs of voters. I think he's going to discuss that more a bit later in some of that work, but I think that's a really important area. We have millions of voters in our state, more than any other state in the country, who English isn't their primary language. And I think, I know that we aren't meeting their needs, and we need to do a better job of that. And that has to be part of our strategy for closing participation gaps. And another area that we're interested in convening some organizations again this year is I'm looking at how do we get the legislature to address these participation gaps and our low turnout in our elections. There was a coalition that came together this year that pushed the legislature around providing funding for nonpartisan voter education and outreach work. We have partners who are especially focused on how do we get funding for community-based organizations to do that kind of culturally competent, multilingual outreach that can help us close these participation gaps. So we're interested in seeing how we can support those groups and help them develop their ideas and bring those to the legislature, and getting the legislature to see this as this is their job to address these issues, address the low turnout, the participation gaps, the misinformation that's out there. And so that's another approach we're going to take this year.
Great. One of the follow-up questions from the audience is that the census hurt language access availability in California. What are statewide solutions to actually provide translated ballots or hotlines, et cetera? And then it goes on to say the Secretary of State only offers about 6 to 7, but not all communities are represented in this. And that's kind of what Tavai was also talking about. So do you have any reflections on how we address this gap in language access?
Tavai, do you want to take that?
You can go ahead and then I'll hop in after.
Okay, so this is an area where California has enormous work to do. Raul mentioned this. We have 2.7 million limited English-speaking voters in California. We have more voters in California who speak English as a second language than some states have voters total. And we are not doing nearly enough to serve those voters. We have in California that we have federal and state law that operates. Federal law offers really high-level forms of language assistance to the largest language communities. And then we have state law that is meant to offer a lighter form of language assistance to smaller language communities. And that law is not working effectively. And I say that as someone who helped write a lot of that law back in 2017. I can acknowledge the work that we did then. We tried it, we experimented with it, we implemented it, and we need to improve it. And so what's happening there is that language communities only receive a light form of language assistance, not including votable ballots, and they only get it when they're geographically concentrated enough to reach certain thresholds within a precinct or within a county. And so what we need to be able to do is figure out how do we use modern voting technology that is more flexible with respect to languages so as to move people off of this second tier of language assistance and onto fully votable ballots in a wide variety of languages. And we're doing that in some ways in a community-based way. So we just partnered with a broad table of community-based organizations in San Diego to work with the Board of Supervisors and the Registrar of Voters to secure for the first time Somali language assistance in the November 2022 election. That's a great step, but we are not going to build the nation's first truly multilingual democracy, which is our project here in California, doing it one county at a time, one language at a time. We need to be looking at structural reform of this. And Raul gestured to it earlier. California Common Cause, Asian Law Caucus, and a wide variety of our partners are leading this statewide language access working group with the hope of surfacing best practices and policy ideas from around the nation and the world that we can bring to California in the next couple legislative sessions.
Thank you. Tavai, you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I mean, our greatest lessons around language access and translation and interpretation for the Pacific Islander community came from Census 2020 and COVID work. Around Census 2020, they announced in February 2018 that they were actually previously in 2010 census, they provided language materials in at least 5 NHPI languages. For 2020, they decided we didn't meet the threshold. And what we constantly sit with as a community is being told that we're too small to matter, that we're statistically insignificant. Well, we understand from this, it's a chicken or the egg. So if you don't provide accessible materials, then people are not going to be counted. If people don't get counted, our communities are not going to look large enough. The irony that we sit with is there are now more Native Hawaiians here on the continent than in Hawaii. There are more Samoans here than there are in Samoa. If we are not large enough here, we are not large enough anywhere. And so how do we shift this understanding of what makes a community matter? What makes something accessible? I really appreciate Jonathan's point of we will not have achieved democracy until we've addressed every single barrier for every single community. The other aspect is we were successful in getting languages prioritized in the state of California for the NHPI community. And then the state turned right back around to EPIC and said, hey, can you do it? Can you do it for us? Because the infrastructure hadn't been created yet. So I also want to acknowledge the work. I appreciate Advancing Justice California is leading around increasing accreditation for Asian languages. We'd like to see something similar for the Pacific Islander community, and also understanding the deep nuances that exist, right? That COVID materials initially from the Marshall Islands that had been translated in the Marshall Islands were translated as a natural disaster as opposed to a medical emergency because they hadn't actually gotten COVID there yet. So it presented this nuance that only community on the ground would know the difference, would be able to see and check and review all of these things. So I think that brings up, even when we get language access, how much we still have to be engaged around the implementation.
Great. And don't go far, Tavad, because this next question I want to kick off with you. Many of our movement leaders are rooted in the nonprofit sector. What does it take to organize communities? If you could share any examples of that, I think it would be really useful. I know you've already shared some, but if you want to expand on that.
Sure, thank you. I really love and appreciate this question. Something that I'm often sitting with and referencing for EPIC as an organization is Deepa Iyer's social change ecosystem and map. EPIC, when it was founded in 2009, was designed to be a builder and a weaver, that we set up systems, that we weave things together, that we convene folks. What the pandemic demanded is that we become frontline responders and healers. It's not our natural state. It's not what we were meant to do. So we shifted immediately to become that, because the dearth of organizations that were prepared to do that was really small. As I stated before, California has the largest NHPI population on the continent. There are maybe 8 NHPI organizations in the entire state with paid staff. That is what the CBO infrastructure looks like for this community. In a place where the demand is always going to significantly outweigh what is actually there. And so it's incumbent upon philanthropy to invest in a community as a whole and the ecosystem and infrastructure for that community. That even if somebody comes in not as a democracy organization, but as a health organization, how do we understand them as critical partners in democracy? Even if it's a Hawaiian Civic Club, and really shifting how we understand what a community needs and how we're going to invest in them and how we invest in their capacity building and growth.
I hear that. And thank you for also making the connection with philanthropy. So that also just makes me want to talk to Raul. Raul, do you want to also weigh in on that?
Well, just another area that our democracy program is looking, or a priority area for us, is around leadership development. And we want to, well, we're supporting new strategies for getting, or trying to move community connected leaders of color into leadership positions, whether that means nonprofit leadership or elected or appointed leadership. We want to support leaders when they get into those new positions as well. And some of that work so far has been focused on our regional civic engagement tables in the state as they're seeking to develop coordinated strategies for their tables about their leadership priorities. And that includes developing organizing leaders and internal leadership amongst their table members. And many of them are also interested in developing new models of co-governance as they're building or winning governing coalitions in their regions. And so we're hoping to support those efforts and learn from them and share what comes out of that work with our other partners.
Great. And Jonathan, I'm going to change the question just slightly for you. Your role's a little different. And one challenge we see in general is misinformation and disinformation, which will likely come into play for the midterms. How do we break through the noise to reach critical communities?
That's such a good question. It feels like one of the biggest emerging issues of democracy in this modern digital era. And I want to highlight that a lot of that misinformation and disinformation hits communities of color the hardest. There's data that shows the misinformation and disinformation in Spanish and Asian languages and other languages gets flagged and addressed by social media platforms at way lower rates than misinformation and disinformation in English, because the people doing the monitoring, the people that work at social media platforms, they are just not familiar with these languages and these communities. And because there is an intentional intent to manipulate communities of color in order to suppress their vote. We live in a moment where our local and ethnic media are collapsing. The business model no longer is thriving, and we have in the last 15 years, California has lost a quarter of its newsrooms. It's lost half of its journalists. The resulting void has been filled by social media misinformation and disinformation. And so there's a variety of ways that we can tackle that, but all of it involves, well, the most direct ways of tackling it involves regulation of social media platforms, which confronts lobbying power, money in politics, and all these other issues in our democracy, because taking on the social media platforms in Sacramento is next to impossible. Another way we can address it, of course, is rebuilding our local and ethnic media sectors. And California Common Cause has a media and democracy program that is looking at state level policy solutions that can help to rebuild our local and ethnic media so that people have good, honest, nonpartisan news sources in their lives. I want to just take 1 second and think about the disillusionment and disgust that so many people feel about our politics. And that's natural if the local news source that used to cover, used to cover your city council working to make the park down the street better and safer. It used to cover your school board improving your kids' schools. But that local news source is gone. It's dead. And instead, all you're getting is national news about our totally gridlocked national politics on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram. And what you think of politics is not government working to make your community better. And I mean, I want to put a pin in that idea because for a lot of communities, it's never really done that. But all you're getting instead is the national culture war nonsense. And if that's your only source of news, of course you're going to think government and politics is gross and not worth your time. So we have to find solutions around, we have to rebuild journalism. We have to recognize that a healthy press is essential to a healthy democracy that includes ethnic media at the core.
Great, thank you. And I think that was a great way to conclude the panel before we jump into the Q&A. And so some of the questions we've already addressed, but this next question is about just understanding the candidates. So how can voters know who to vote for? And then there was additional language there. This can build momentum. It can be very hard to learn about candidates from a neutral source rather than from marketing materials. And yeah, so this year I got so many mailers from a candidate, which is a waste of money. So basically, how do we break through the noise to identify which candidates are serving the communities of need that we're trying to prioritize? And that's open to all three panelists. And I could start too. I will say that for me, it's often about doing the research, doing additional research, doing a Google on these candidates, learning about their political platform and what they are for and what they're against. Sometimes it's also really helpful for me to see who else is supporting them in their campaigns. But I would love to hear from you if there's anything else that you would add to that.
One longtime resource out there, I mean, is the League of Women Voters provides the Easy Voter Guide, which they try to use like simple language to explain what's on the ballot. It's translated, it's available. They do a lot of work to try to get into as many hands as possible into libraries. It's available online. They also partner, I believe, with MapLight on another resource called Voter's Edge, where you can learn more. They work to try to get statements from all the candidates and get them to answer questions and try to make it more transparent about where their funding comes from. So those are some decent resources about what's on the ballot and about candidates. I think I don't rely on what comes in the mail. The mailers are, these slates that come through, they just have these generic names and it's hard to figure out where the money's coming from, what they actually stand for. So, there are a lot of organizations, the organizations I believe in rely on, I do go and see who they've endorsed. That's another source that I use.
Great. Bye, Jonathan. Anything you want to add before we go to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just lift up, I think as recognizing how C3 status can feel like the most limiting part of trying to advise our communities on candidates, as we always want to steer really clear of those things. I appreciate we have a lot of partners who create a C4 arm so that they can better engage in those conversations, because that's what communities have asked for, direct guidance around candidates. I also want to lift up and appreciate the work of groups. My Girls in Actions has invited us to their candidate forums, Filipino worker centers, who have created candidate forums that invite all of the candidates to be nonpartisan. And also are some of the only spaces where these candidates will be forced to talk about and address the needs of our communities. That this isn't going to happen in other forums. And so I think those have been successful places, and that our voter guides have really just been about proposition work as we're clear what that is. And then also want to appreciate the work of groups like Boulder Advocacy, who have provided guidance for C3s on what is the fine line you can walk around giving the guidance the communities are asking for.
Go ahead, Raul.
Oh.
It's just a reminder, especially like in this primary and with the turnout, that just, we make it so hard on voters. There's so much on the ballot and it's hard to find the answers they want. And so I think one of the reasons people turn away because they don't feel informed enough. And anyway, it's a source of frustration. That's not an answer, but just, it is a source of frustration, how hard it can be.
So Tavai mentioned earlier the fact that communities of color and immigrant communities represent the lowest, receive the lowest amount of contact by political parties. I was once doing voter registration work at a day worker center in Santa Cruz County, and did this whole spiel about voter registration and the importance of voting. And a man raises his hand at the end and says, "I'm not sure I would be comfortable voting if I don't know what I'm voting on. No one has ever contacted me to give me information about what I'd be voting on." And I said, how many, a lot of households, and this was in the moment, I said, a lot of households get so much campaign mail that they're sick of it and they just take it and throw it in the recycling. And this gentleman his mind was blown because he'd never received a single piece of campaign mail ever. And we have to change that fact. One of the ideas that I think is not that campaign mail is the be all and end all, but it has a way of signaling to a household, you're important, you're on our radar, we're actually trying. One of the things that we're working on is something called Democracy Dollars, a program from Seattle that we're trying to bring to the city of Oakland, where you give every eligible adult, not just citizens, every eligible adult 4 $25 vouchers that they can donate to municipal candidates. What it does is it turns every household into a donor household. Now, all of a sudden, the households, the communities, the neighborhoods, the candidates are skipping. They have a reason to door knock. They have a reason to mail. They have a reason to phone bank. And the data from Seattle is it increases the number of small donors very substantially, increases the diversity of donors very substantially, Democracy Dollars. It increases the diversity of candidates because community-backed candidates who don't have personal wealth or networks of wealth can run viable campaigns. And the most empowering finding out of Seattle is that it dramatically increases voter participation among first-time voters and low-propensity voters, because for the first time, candidates are doing the work and parties are doing the work of drawing them in to Seattle's local democracy. So we're trying to get that on the ballot in Oakland in November of 2022.
Great, thank you. That was all really helpful. And I would just also reflect quickly before going into the next question that even in English, it's really difficult to process what each of the propositions is saying. Sometimes voting yes means no and voting no means yes. And so then to have to translate that as well, like becomes really complicated in terms of language. So here's another question. One of the ongoing gaps in organizing in long-term follow-up is long-term follow-up. We do speak to voters and residents between census and elections. We do not go back and study our data to compare if those people have gone from first contact to consistent voters, people participating in democracy. What are some ways to improve this? So that goes back to a little bit of the voter engagement. Like, how do we know that the touches that we have with community result in voter turnout? And anyone can take that.
For us, I mean, it's why we're funding we fund organizations for their work year round, for their power building work year round, not just around catching voters next the election. It's part of their strategy, but it's not the only thing they're doing. That's part of our grant making strategy.
Great. Can you all follow up and speak a little bit more about that fine line of the 501c3s and what can we share and what can't we share with our communities? Because I think, everyone on here is a nonprofit, the 501c3. And I think that this, that boundary of advocacy versus lobbying or any other sort of thing that would put the 501c3 at risk. Could you share any more specific information on that?
I can. I'm not an expert on this, but just the basics of the law are that 501c3s, as a result of their tax status, are not able to endorse candidates and support or oppose candidates, and oftentimes that creates a caution that radiates out towards other activities, and so you end up being a little gun shy about just sharing candidates' records, which you should be able to do, or talking about how one candidate is good on a particular piece of public policy and another candidate is not good on a piece of public policy. If you're a housing organization, you should, under a technical interpretation of the law, be able to say, Supervisor so-and-so is terrible on housing. But the experts will tell you if you do that too close to an election, and if you're also saying that Supervisor so-and-so is great on housing, and those two happen to be running against each other, and all these other conditions are in play, now suddenly you're towing the line, and it may not be as safe as you think. And people just end up being really gun shy. Boulder Advocacy deserves a ton of credit for trying to help groups with this, but it's an ongoing issue. Tavai, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, all of those things, right? I think that's also where Raul's point around year round is super helpful, because if you are already known to be someone who makes these critiques, no matter whether it's election cycle or not, that you are consistently handing out, informal report cards of elected officials or incumbents or candidates, that it's very clear for folks, right, that this is just, it's part of your work. I think the other part is not just C3 status. Much of funding explicitly says we can't do these things, right? When we think about the funding sources that people receive, the majority of them will outline in contracts, in things, that you cannot use our money to do this. You cannot use our money on these purposes. And so that becomes another thing that starts to dictate and shape the programming that people will put out, right? That we have to get very creative or clear. And then I will also say I really appreciate the work of the Women's Foundation of California and how they've also trained folks around. There's actually more lobbying that nonprofits can do and just don't in wanting to really skirt the edge around things. And even our decision to be a fiscally sponsored project is so we can take advantage of that percentage, right? If you can only use a 25% of your budget to do lobbying, like if I'm part of a $60 million organization, then I can do 25% of $60 million, not just this small project that I have, or relatively small. And so I think those are the calculations that we make as an organization, and that we sit with and also have conversations, so that it's not just a social media post that we're putting out, but that we're actually engaging with folks and pointing them to trusted resources, and then engaging those, even if we're not their trusted messenger, that we know their trusted messenger, that we're in deep relationship and community with them. And I think that's going to be more important as we have a faith-based organizer who will be doing things in the faith institutions, which we know are critical sites of countering misinformation and disinformation in the PI community, and also leveraging folks who are already gifted at engaging our communities.
Great. And in the last 10 minutes or so that we have left, I would love for us to tackle a couple more of these questions. Can any of you talk about voting and the census within our unhoused communities? How can someone experiencing homelessness register to vote? Are there any efforts to increase access to voting? Yeah, leave it there. Do any of you have experience with that?
I have, as someone who's done some voter registration in, with unhoused communities, I just have some firsthand experience, but I can't say that I've worked on it in a systemic sort of way. The voter registration form in California allows for a place for people to describe their physical location where they spend the most time in the event that they don't have a mailing address. So they can say on this street corner, for example, folks who are unhoused can also receive mail and register to vote in some instances at a shelter or at some sort of agency that collects their mail. But in terms of consistent efforts to do IVE in unhoused communities, that's beyond my experience and probably the domain of homelessness advocates and community services organizations.
Great.
One thing I'll just add to that is, so our state is about half of our voters now are voting in a county that has adopted the Voters' Choice Act. The Voters' Choice Act in California is this reform. Most of you all are probably familiar with it, but part of the big change is that you limit the number, you go to a much smaller number of in-person voting locations it's roughly like a 90% reduction. And so instead of a neighborhood polling place, you're moving to a vote center. And these vote centers, they're open for more days, or 11 total days. And so it has advantages, and you can, but there are also much fewer, many fewer sites. And something that I observed when we were adopting that here in Sacramento, the Voters' Choice Act, was a lack of concern for where the unhoused communities were, and in terms of putting a vote center that might serve their needs. They're harder to, the data isn't as good about on where they are, and so they weren't necessarily considered in terms of where we were putting vote centers. And so that's just, as counties are adopting it, it's something to be aware of, that the needs of unhoused voters are being considered when we're deciding, when we're closing most of our polling places, where we put those vote centers, and making sure it's reaching folks that where unhoused communities are at the, in the counties. It's not just something to keep in mind.
Yes. Well, this has been such an interesting conversation, and we've touched on so many different issues. And so as we close this session, I'm wondering if you have some closing remarks that you want to share with the audience before we wrap up. Jonathan, do you want to start? You look eager.
Yeah, sorry, that's just my face. I am eager though. I think my closing remark is that in this moment when our democracy feels like it's in crisis, and we're increasingly aware of which the ways, the structures of our democracy, the nature of our electorate, it's influencing and impacting every issue we work on, from health to education to immigration to everything. Every funder needs to be a democracy funder, and every organization needs to be a democracy organization. And I don't mean that they need to completely change their agenda and their portfolio to work on the stuff that Common Cause works on, but everyone needs to put 5% of their time and attention to thinking about the ways in which, like, hey, the outcomes we're trying to get on housing in our community are hugely impacted by redistricting and money in politics, because developers are giving campaign contributions to our city council, and then they're drawing the city council lines to keep themselves in power. Every organization is a democracy organization. Every funder is a democracy funder, whether they know it or not, whether they want it to be true or not. And so that's my major takeaway for our community.
Great. Tavai or Raul, do you want to go next?
Sure, I echo Jonathan's sentiment that I'd love to see everyone doing more democracy work. And just remember, we've raised some of these. There's a lot to be proud of here of what we've accomplished in California, but we do have democracy issues. We have low turnout. We have participation gaps. We saw in redistricting powers that are not letting go of incumbents not letting go of power in ways to empower voters of color. And there's work to be done here. We still have reforms that are being implemented, and we need to do more to reach voters and get them engaged. And our goal and our vision is to make California a model for the country, and to show that a multiracial, multilingual, multicultural democracy can thrive. And that's what we need to be, a model for the country in that way. And so I appreciate everyone joining, and great questions. Thank you for having me, Kristen.
And Tavai, you have the last word.
I wasn't trying to make it that way, but okay. So, sorry, someone's calling. You know, I often sit with the irony of being a social justice organization, which means that we spend the majority of our time telling our community that these systems are not designed for them, and that they should be critiquing and heavily interrogating these systems. And then we also ask them to engage in them. And I recognize the ways that that can seem contradictory. So what I sit with and I'm really clear about when I talk to our communities is that this notion that your vote doesn't matter is ragged individualism. That in the Pacific Islander community, if you understand your role in a village, you would never think that that role didn't matter. And I really appreciate and echo the sentiments. There's a poet, Carolyn Carl, and she said, they carve tables, we carve canoes because we have to move. We have to move. And so I want that to be the primary sentiment that leads folks in, and that in a philanthropic office audience, I also want to be clear how often our communities are asked to put our suffering on display in order to prove our need. And what I'm excited about in conversations of democracy and civic engagement is it's an opportunity for us to flex our power and be really clear that none of this works without us. That it's actually a point to say that we are so strong and you are stronger because we exist.
Great. Tabai, Jonathan, Raul, thank you so much for your insights. And I also want to take a moment and thank Carla and Emily and the Cal Nonprofits for putting this together, for allowing us to share our perspective, because this is all really important work. And as we all endured the COVID-19 pandemic, we also just understand why we need a representation in our government to make sure that we get the resources and that we have the ability to respond to the highest needs of our communities. So thank you so much for your leadership in this space, all three of you. And thank you for today's conversation. And thank you to the audience for participating. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.